Good morning. I'm Bunny Herzl, the other half of the Book Review Committee, and it's nice to see you all. And I am delighted to introduce our reviewer today. Ken graduated from the University of Dayton. You'll hear me, yes?
No. Yes.
Yes, a little higher.
Perfect. Clifford, they'd like a little more volume.
Ken graduated from the University of Dayton in Ohio and worked as a newspaperman for about 34 years, with the last 24 years here at the Columbian in Portland. Ken wrote this book. Oh, but you lived in Portland.
That's why I was always
Don't
late for
confuse
work.
me. Ken wrote this book with Chris about Gaston history. Chris graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle. She's had a very busy career, and after 11 years as assistant to the president of Pacific University in Hillsborough, Chris retired in 2011. Also with us today is Vicki Bilderback, Ken's sister, who flew in from her home in Hawaii. Thank you both. Ken retired in 2004, and he and Chris moved from northwest Portland to an acre on a hill in Gaston. That acre is now known as Little Quail Creek Farm, where they plan to garden and tend to cats and chickens. After a bit, Ken jumped into volunteering as the volunteer public information officer for the local fire department in Gaston, and found himself answering media questions from around the country about everything, from horses rescued from creeks to 8 children saved from drowning in Hag Lake. Truly a writer at heart, Ken wrote Wheels on the Bus: Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll, and Life in 1974, about his teenage years, published in 2010. Then Ken and Chris took a great leap of faith by deciding to work together full-time, researching, writing, and marketing books about Oregon history. Their first joint effort, Creek with No Name: How the West Was Won and Lost in Gaston, was published in 2012 and has won many national and regional awards. I read that wrong. Has won many national and international awards, including first place for regional literature in Boston and San Diego, first runner-up for the History Prize at the New York Book Festival, and honorable mentions in San Francisco, Hollywood, and just 3 weeks ago in London, England. Ken is no stranger to Willamette View, spending 17 Christmas Eve dinners with his mother, Pearl Bilderback, who was a resident here until her death in 2006. Pearl used to lead tours on the nature trail. She was a great source of information and a really good friend. Please welcome Ken.
Have a leash here. How's that for volume? Is that good? Okay. Well, Bunny has told you pretty much everything you need to know about me and a whole lot more. But first of all, thank you for having us. It's, I think, a little emotional for all of us to be back here, because we haven't been back here since my mother died. But man, have we spent a lot of hours here over the years. As you've heard, this is a book. I didn't know this was a book review group, so I'll give you a brief review of the book. It's excellent. It's an absolute must-read. So it all started, we bought an acre in Gaston out in the country, and on the deed to the property it said that it was waterfront property. And we looked all around and there's no water. So I made a joke to the realtor that there's no waterfront here. And he said, oh yes there is. There's a creek running through your property, but you just can't see it because it's buried under 20 feet of blackberry brambles, and this was in September, so it was at its lowest level, and you couldn't hear it. So I got on the phone to the county water master and said, described where I lived, and he knew exactly where the creek was. And I said, well, what's the creek's name? And he said, oh, it doesn't have a name. I said, well, where does it flow? And he says it's part of the Wapato Lake watershed. And I said, well, where's Wapato Lake? And he said, oh, it doesn't exist anymore. So that kind of got me going, you know, tracing. We made the joke, of course, that we live by the creek with no name that flows into a lake that doesn't exist anymore. But it sort of got us rolling on exploring local history. And I, first of all, want to prove to you that I know how to use technology. There we go. I want to prove to you first that there is indeed a creek. This is during the spring when it's actually flowing, and it's a pretty good-sized creek. But we still, you know, it's still just a creek until I started cutting away all the blackberry brambles and that sort of thing, and literally they were in places 20 or more feet deep. I thought we had a hill on the property, and oh, it ran out, so I'll go out. And this hill was, you know, up to about this ceiling here, and I thought we had a hill there. And I was going to cut away the blackberry brambles on this hill. And as I kept hacking, I just kept going farther and farther into the hill, and it was all blackberry brambles. Well, it turns out there was a limb of a tree about that height, and the blackberry brambles had grown up over it and that sort of thing. And by the time I got down to the bottom, I found a deflated basketball from the Trailblazers championship in 1977, and a little prescription bottle that was also from 1977, and still had pills in it. I don't remember what they were, but this really got me interested, and about this time neighbors started coming by, thanking me for clearing the creek and telling me about how they had played there as children and that sort of thing, and telling us the history of this area. And I just got so intrigued that I started following the path of this creek, which does indeed go into Wapato Lake, but we'll get to that in a minute. In the meantime, I figured out that it flows into the Tualatin River, which is, most of you know, comes out on the Willamette just south of here, and it flows right past here, which is part of the journey I took in my mind. This little tiny creek that comes through our property, no name, no real history, but you can think about a drop of water that flows through that little creek that comes down through the Tualatin, up the Willamette, up the Columbia, into the ocean, connecting all of Northwest Oregon, really. And that's why Creek with No Name became a metaphor, basically, for tracing the history of Gaston. And as I traced the history of Gaston, I realized that the history of Gaston tells the whole history of Western Oregon when you come right down to it. And I was just too lazy to go anywhere but Gaston, so I made sure every story focused on an event or a person from Gaston. And the first one I want to talk about is one who is famous along the same river. You go a mile or so north, and how many of you remember this building? Did anybody here by any chance ever know Staff Jennings or his children? But you all know the sign, right? There's a chapter in the book about Staff Jennings. His name is Stafford Jennings. He was born in Gaston in 1900. Before he was 8 years old, he had witnessed 2 violent deaths. One, which, as far as we know, was a suicide after a shootout with the police in his house over a love triangle. A few years later, there was another death involved at his house involving one of the members of the love triangle. The official cause of death for that one was established to be death by cow, but we don't believe it. I don't believe it for a minute. And this is all before he's 8 years old. By the time he was 18, he was featured in a book by Lowell Thomas. I'm sure a lot of you remember Lowell Thomas, the old newsman. He wrote a book about Staff and his father, H.B. Jennings, and a few others. And the book was called The Wreck of the Tomorrow, Cannibalism on the Open Seas. So here's this 18-year-old Staff Jennings who has already been involved in shootouts. Well, he wasn't. He was child. He witnessed a shoot-up with the police, he witnessed this other death, and now he's in a rowboat, in a lifeboat, out in the South Pacific for 24 days, while other people on the boat are eating each other. Quite an interesting little story for someone who was born in sleepy little Gaston. And, you know, until I started researching this, because I lived in I've been in Oregon, in the Portland area for 32 years. I've seen the sign all the time, but I had never associated Staff Jennings with a person. Yet it's a name that almost everybody in Portland knows. And he's got just an incredible history, and it all revolves around Gaston. Another one of the mysteries, as we started to research this book, I've always been interested in history, but I have a special sort of affinity for Native American history. And we heard that Gaston was sort of a center for Native American life. And it turns out that it really was. It was the center of the Native Americans in the Tuolumne Valley because of that mythical Wapato Lake that didn't exist when we moved in. That was holy ground, basically, for the Atfalati Indians. Atfalati is actually the real name, the academic name of the Tualatin Indians. And they were centered in Gaston. And one of the legends about their stay in Gaston were some petroglyphs, which are very rare in this part of Oregon. As you go out the gorge and some places along the coast, petroglyphs are fairly common. But in the Willamette Valley, they're extraordinarily rare, either because they weren't done or they have been moved or destroyed. So we heard legend of this petroglyph. There are several of them on a rock, but nobody knew where they were. We asked around town, we made calls, nobody could tell us where they were. By total happenstance, Chris and I stumbled upon them, so we have a number of pictures. But that too then became sort of a metaphor, in my mind, for the history of Gaston. Because here you have these rock carvings that have been there since who knows when. And by the way, if you read the book, there are some very funny stories about petroglyphs and how they came to become lost to history and that sort of thing. But that face, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that that face has been there since long before you came to things like the railroad, which is now ancient history too, because there's no railroad in Gaston anymore. That was the whole reason Gaston was built. I don't know how many of you know about Joseph Gaston, for whom the town is named. He's most famous today because he wrote a book called The Centennial History of Oregon, which is still considered to be one of the most definitive volumes of history of the state of Oregon. And there's hardly a person or village in the state of Oregon that isn't in this huge 4-volume history that he wrote of the state of Oregon, with one exception. In the entire 4-volume history, there's not one single word about the town of Gaston, the town that was named for it. I would probably, if I had a town named after me, I'd probably mention it. I don't know, that's me. But as you read the history of Gaston, you find out that the railroad is another sort of metaphor for history. Because Joseph Gaston had the rights to build the railroad down along the Willamette River from Portland through Salem, through Eugene, and on into California. That was a very lucrative line. But a fellow by the name of Ben Holliday, you probably know about Holiday Park and that sort of thing. Ben Holliday was a rival railroad man, and he bribed the entire state legislature with only $15,000 for the whole legislature. Pretty cheap, huh? This was back in the 1860s. To get that line, they gave Joseph Gaston a line from Hillsborough to Corvallis. Yeah, who cares, So he did his best. He built the railroad, but he went broke because nobody rode the railroad, and it was just a mess. So his time spent in the town that's named after him was the most bitter time of his life. So you would think his most lasting legacy is really a legacy to a broken dream. Because he moved to Portland. He has a magnificent house up in the West Hills of Portland. If you ever get a chance, it's on the National Register. He rebuilt his fortune, but he had a pretty miserable time in Gaston. He lost his fortune. And as you start reading about Gaston, studying Gaston, you realize it's kind of the history of the town. There's a little area west of Gaston called Cherry Grove. And how many people have heard of Cherry Grove? Yeah, you would. But it's nothing now. It's a little unincorporated area. It's the dead end of the Oregon Trail. There's one dead end road into town, and that's it. At one time, it was the biggest city in Washington County because of a man named August Lovegren, who came in with this grand dream of a utopian community. He was a Swedish lumberman, and he came in, built a huge lumber mill, and was going to build a utopian religious community in Cherry Grove. And for a time, there were multiple hotels in Cherry Grove. They're thriving business. It had its own railroad. Big town. This is the dam he built. It's still, you can still see a lot of it. But if you think about it, 99 years ago today, this dam was less than a year old, about 4 months old, and was holding back a huge lake. 99 years from next week, it looked like this. Because 4 months after he had spent years building this dam in his town, the first winter, he went live with the dam in October. In January, it rains in Oregon. I guess he didn't think that through, maybe. But it rained that winter, and the water backed up and blew out the other end of this dam. So after all that work, all those dreams, he was left with a broken dam. He was left broke, moved away, another broken dream. The book is full of people who came into town with grandiose ideas. And as you probably know about Gaston, we don't have very many grandiose things in Gaston because people, it's almost like it's where dreams go to die in some ways. People come with the best of intentions and walk away empty-handed. So this is yet another sort of metaphor for me about the development of Gaston. This is another one. This is a fire, as you obviously. Mr. Obvious, they call me. This is a fire in 1993. This was a private residence and a welding shop. But everyone in Gaston knows it as the cheese factory fire. The reason is that back in the 1930s, Gaston was a center of dairy farming. And as were several towns, including a little town called Tillamook that many of you have heard about. Tillamook got this crazy idea that they would hire a man named Peter McIntosh, who is one of the best known cheesemakers in the country, to come and develop cheese for Tillamook. And they did, and he came, and he was there for a couple of years, and he developed the recipe for Tillamook cheese that is still used, Tillamook cheddar, which is still used to this day to make the cheese. But the farmers of Gaston said, we're not going to let Tillamook be the cheese capital of Oregon. Gaston is going to be the cheese capital of Oregon. So they built this, which was a cheese factory. Once again, huge dreams, best cheesemaker in certainly the western United States, moves to town, and guess what? He dies. Just out of nowhere. So he's buried in Gaston on a hill just about a mile from our house with a nice big headstone honoring him as the father of Oregon cheese. But Gaston has nothing to show for it. So this was for 40 years used as a bus barn for the school district and all kinds of other things. But it was still, we still held on to that dream that it was a cheese factory. But even that, as you can see, it's gone now. Which leads me into the next aspect of fire. This is a little fire. It actually is not as big as it looks. But that's a fire that started just down the hill from our house, not long after I joined the fire department. And this too, for me, in many ways, sort of tells the story of Gaston and the community that exists there, even though all those many dreams have been killed. It's still a very vibrant, thriving community in its own way. And one of the things that really holds it together is the fire department and volunteers. When this picture was taken, this fella, right there, had been a firefighter for about 2 weeks, maybe, 10 days. They got out of the academy. So the veteran back here was leading him. He had been a firefighter for 2 months. And behind this, if I had brought the video of the fire that I did, you'd hear people yelling instructions and orders and that sort of thing. And the people yelling would be a 22-year-old at that time named Randy Hoodenpyle, who is a career firefighter, one of the best firefighters in the state of Oregon, in part because his father was also on the scene, Jerry Hoodenpyle, who's been a volunteer firefighter in Gaston for nearly 40 years, and still is not considered a real long-timer, even though he's our most veteran firefighter at the time. But you trace the families that have served on Gaston Fire. You have multiple families where the Hoodenpyle family, for example, except for a few years in the 1950s, basically, has had somebody serving on the fire department since before there was the Gaston Fire Department in the early 1900s. And they're not the only family like that. And that's that kind of spirit. After I joined the fire department and started meeting these families. And here's a little tip: if you go to a small town like Gaston, because there's a story about Dayton, but if you go to a small town like Gaston, don't ever say anything bad about anyone, because no matter who you're talking to, they're probably related to the person you're bad about. That's a lesson I learned quickly, and it's one I never forget. And by sitting around the fire station talking to these people, they'll say, oh yeah, my great uncle Joe came over on a wagon train and that sort of thing. The roots of history in a town like Gaston go back to the Oregon Trail. Unfortunately, people knew this history. People talked about this history right up until about the 1970s, 1980s, when like Bertie Nixon and that sort of thing, they knew all this stuff, and then that whole generation died away, and the next generation didn't really care. So there's almost no history written about Gaston. You go to the Washington County Historical Society, and they have one little envelope with maybe 30 newspaper clippings, and that's the recorded history, the official recorded history of Gaston. And yet you start digging deeper into the archives of the Oregonian, for example, or the Fourth Grove News-Times, and you start finding fascinating people who came either from Gaston or who came through Gaston. Everything from a fellow by the name of Herman Rochning, who I admit I'd never heard of, but he was very famous in World War II because he wrote a book called Hitler Speaks, which at the time was considered to be sort of almost the definitive story of Hitler. It was a huge bestseller, huge propaganda effort for the Allies because it was very critical. Rochning claimed to have been practically Hitler's right-hand man before he decided that the Nazis were wrong. Huge. He settled in Gaston. Well, once again, big mistake. If things are going well for you in life, don't move to Gaston. Because just about the time he moved to Gaston, this internationally famous author, people start finding holes in his story. And by the time it was done, it was determined he was a total fraud. He had been a Nazi, a low-level Nazi, but he plagiarized novel, an unpublished novel about Hitler. Total fraud. But it wasn't until he came to Gaston that anybody figured that out. Fascinating characters that tell so much about the story of how Oregon was created, how the West was settled, how the Native Americans were driven off the land, because Wapato Lake was their sacred area when, back in the 1850s, when the white settlers were creating donation land claims and that sort of thing, they were moving all the Native Americans off their land. The Native Americans said, please just let us have Wapato Lake. It's sacred to us. Our whole lives revolve around it. And the white settlers said, you can have it. It's a mosquito-infested swamp. We don't want it. But back in Washington, D.C., they decided differently. They created the Swamp Act, which was created for Florida and Louisiana, but then applied to the whole country. And all of a sudden, you had this gigantic, at its peak, it was about 12,000 acre lake, that 1,200 acre lake, I'm sorry, that was considered a swamp, and they offered it up for free to anybody who would be willing to drain it and turn it into farmland. And Joseph Gaston was the one to step forward and say, I'll do that. He drained the lake. They moved the Indians. They wanted to move the Indians over to the east, over to eastern Oregon. And of course, that's not an easy thing for a tribe that has never been more than, maybe 20 miles from Wapato Lake to get packed up and moved to distant eastern Oregon. But that was the plan they had after the treaty had been signed. That reservation is now the Grand Ronde Reservation, so Spirit Mountain Casino and all that could have been in Gaston, could have been famous. But we're not. The bus to Spirit Mountain Casino goes through Gaston, if that counts for anything, from Portland. Every step of the way you find these things. Joseph Gaston was never able to drain Wapato Lake. They chased the Indians away. But he tried for 20 years or more to drain it, never could. He'd build a dike, and the dike would look real solid in the summer. Then the rains would come, and the dike would wash out, and they'd figure out that we have gophers in Gaston. Well, we have lots of gophers in Gaston. And you get enough gophers in a levee, and the levee just washes away. So he was never able to drain the lake, and that's part of why he just said, I don't ever want to hear about this town again, I'm leaving, and split for Portland. Finally, people did drain the lake successfully. And when they did, they figured out that it was perfect farmland for onions. Gaston became one of the onion capitals of the West Coast. The name of the onion brand has slipped my mind now, but anyways, it became this huge center for onions. Well, it happens that the Japanese, apparently, are very good at growing onions. And so Gaston became a center of Japanese culture. And by 1942, more than a quarter of the town of Gaston and the surrounding area was Japanese. They moved into a lot of the homes that the Chinese railroad workers had lived in. But of course, once the railroad was done, they ran the Chinese out of town, which opened up housing for the Japanese farmers to come in and grow onions. And so, like I said, by 1942, Gaston was more than a quarter Japanese. There was a little Japanese town on a street called Onion Lane. It's very colorful. Onion Lane is still there, but the fire station is on Onion Lane, in fact. But 1942, some of you might remember, something happened in December of 1941. Pearl Harbor was bombed, and someone had the bright idea that we had to take all the Japanese people and put them in internment camps. So here's Gaston, whose economy was largely dependent upon the Japanese farmers, and all of a sudden they all get scooped up and sent to internment camps in Northern California and Eastern Oregon. Today, if you look at the school pictures from 1942, 1941, 1940, in some of the pictures, half the class or more are Japanese kids. Today, you'd probably have to drive 20 miles to find a Japanese face. One family moved back. The rest just said, screw Gaston. You know, we're just, it's where dreams go to die. And they never came back. Now, just a little aside that has always bothered me, the other major ethnic group, if you will, in the Gaston area are Germans, because Germans happen to be very good loggers. So World War II started, and all the Japanese farmers were picked up and kicked out, but the German loggers continued to log unabated. Yeah, I mean, you know, there are reasons for that, I'm sure. But we still have German names all over, but you don't find any Japanese names. And that leads me to probably my last real story about Gaston. How are we doing on time? Oh, plenty of time, okay. I'm hoping maybe there'll be some questions, because I can talk all day. And I will if you make me so. There's something else about Gaston that many of you will probably know, even though you don't associate it with Gaston. And the story of that can be told through a lumber mill called Stimson Lumber, which is still there. It's still out by Hag Lake, which it was there long before anyone ever dreamed of Hag Lake. Stimson Lumber was the dream of C.W. Stimson, a Seattle lumberman. And he was already extraordinarily wealthy, but he had this dream, common thread here, a dream, that he was going to create the biggest, most technologically advanced lumber mill in the world. And naturally, you can help me with this, someone guessed, where did he think a perfect location for that mill would be? Gaston. This was in 1929. Something else happened in 1929. Just after they started building the mill and business was, you know, the economy was booming, the roaring 20s and all. The economy of Gaston was booming too because of all the stills, because that's where everybody could hide out from the revenuers, and so Gaston was buzzing right along at that time. And C.W. Stimson said Gaston is the perfect place to become the richest lumber baron in the world. And he started to plant, and then in October of 1929, the stock market crashed. But fortunately for C.W. Stimson, he had enough money that he could ride this out, and he continued to build the mill. It took longer than he expected it to. It took 4 years to build the mill rather than, I think, 2 that he was expecting. But he built this magnificent mill, and it was all set to open in October of 1933. Now, problem is, in August of 1933, just as the mill was being completed, we were in one of the hottest, driest stretches of weather in Oregon history. And for the first time, it got so bad, the fire conditions got so terrible, that the governor said, I don't even know if I have the authority to do this, but I'm stepping in and I'm going to shut down logging because the danger is just too hot. And I'm going to shut it down at, I think it was 1 p.m. sometime during the day of August 13th, 1933. So most of the loggers just said, we won't even go out in the woods. But if you said, we are going to go out there and we're going to get every last log we can this morning before it gets shut down, because we don't know how long it'll be shut down. Well, the last loggers pulling out the last logs set off a spark, which ignited a fire, which started small, but soon became known as the Tillamook Burn. So it burned out from where? Gaston, between Gaston and Forest Grove. You know, there actually was a series of fires, but by the time it was all over, it had burned the forest basically from Gaston all the way to the coast and almost up to the Columbia River. Just, you know, gigantic fire. 3 months or so before Stimson was going to open his mill. Stimson had a bright idea though. He said, first of all, most of the timber companies who owned the land said, we're out of here. We thought Gaston was a good place to follow our dreams, but it's not. So they just left. They just said, you guys take the land, the government, we're gone. Stimson said, well, to the government, well, that's just another disaster waiting to happen. Let me have all those logs for free. So he was able to go in and make his mill a go by salvaging the lumber. And he actually did build the Stimson Mill into the sort of the cornerstone of the Northwest logging industry. This was in 1933. In 1935, the Depression was still going really strong. And first the longshoremen in the Northwest, and then the timber operators decided they were going to form unions and go on strike. And they did. But the only mill that didn't shut down was Stimson, partly because he paid higher wages, partly because Gaston was so depressed. So they kept working. But the timber unions focused on the Gaston mill just as much as the timber industry did, because they figured if they could shut down Gaston, they could shut down the Northwest timber industry. So they tried to go on strike, and the governor at the time, Charles W. Martin, decided that he had had enough and he was going to make the poor folks of Gaston the guinea pigs for his policies. And he sent in a posse of heavily armed people with instructions, written instructions, to, quote, beat the hell out of the strikers in Gaston, which they did. And then they marched them about 10 miles at gunpoint to the nearest jail in Forest Row. So where is the biggest example of labor strife in the state of Oregon? Where did it happen? Gaston. And who would have known? You know, that's a story that, like most of these stories, those are stories that really have kind of faded away. Even in a little town like Gaston, a lot of people don't remember or don't want to talk about that strike when Grandpa got beat up with a log and forced to walk 10 miles. So getting these stories can be very difficult, even from people who lived through them. We hear about things that we knew happened within the lifespan of people still alive, and they would at least feign ignorance of it. So 4 years into living in Gaston, working on the history of the fire department now for a year or so, all of a sudden I hear from a young firefighter, have you written about the murders? And I said, no. What murders? And he didn't really know because his parents were around when it happened, but they didn't want to talk about it. So I do a little searching on the web. Turns out it's one of the most famous murders in Oregon history. And where did it happen, by the way? Yes. And it, not only that, but it turns out it happened on the property directly south of ours. You go to the edge of our property and you look down the hill and you can see the foundation of the house where this happened. What happened is in 1977, the Hells Angels were running a prostitution ring down in San Francisco, and one of the prostitutes turned state evidence. And they put her into essentially the witness protection program. And they decided that the perfect place for young Margot Compton to rebuild her life would be Gaston. So she moved up to Gaston with her 2 little 6-year-old daughters, who by all accounts were just gorgeous little children. The Hells Angels specifically said to their members, leave her go, it's not worth it. Nothing major happened from the trial, and it's not worth the murder, so just leave her alone. The only problem is that 2 guys two wannabe Hells Angels thought that they could make a name for themselves by coming up to Oregon, tracking her down, and killing her, which they did. But before they killed her, They also killed a young man who was staying at the house with her. He was about 21. He was on leave from the Coast Guard, recovering from an injury. And then they made Margot Compton go into the bedroom where her 6-year-old daughters were sleeping and made her watch as they shot the 2 6-year-old girls in the head. And only then did they kill Margot Compton. Well, this murder went unsolved for more than a decade, until up in Washington, one of these wannabe Hells Angels, who is now serving life in prison for a totally unrelated crime, because apparently Hells Angels don't stop at one crime. That's another lesson I've learned. So he's in prison, and he brags to one of the other prisoners that he did this murder. The reason the murder became really big news was that that was still the first and only time that the Hells Angels and the Aryan Brotherhood said to all their other members, feel free to go testify against these jerks. Because even for them, that murder was way beyond the pale. That was just nothing. So in 1995, there's a steady stream of Hells Angels and Aryan Brotherhood, mostly prison inmates, lining up to go into the courthouse in Hillsborough to testify against these 2 guys about this murder, which is now taught at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and all numbers of other places because it took so long to solve and it was so bizarre. And that murder, unbeknownst to me, because I followed that as a newspaper person, we had reporters at the courthouse, but to me, Gaston was, at that time, was off the map. I didn't know anything about it. I knew all about the crime. I didn't have a clue that it happened in Gaston. Not only that, but in the property next to it. So, it looks like I'm running out of time. That's a very long-winded way of just leading up to the book. And I put this slide up here only to show off some of the awards we've won. It is a review, so I think it's only fair that I point out that it's an award-winning book, right? And with that, I mean, that's how the book came to be. We got it all done. We said, whew, we've covered every single topic you could ever find about Gaston. But we were wrong, because once we put the book out, people kept coming to us with more stories. So in a couple of months, we're releasing the next book, which is a history of volunteer firefighting in the rural West, but again, it's focused on Gaston. One of the recurring themes of the fire book is that we have almost no historic buildings in Gaston because they've all burned down. Every other town up and down the valley has tons of old homes and churches, and we got nothing. So that's the next book that's coming out, and we not only have enough for that, but in a couple years, we're going to release a book about the Pioneer Cemetery in town, Hill Cemetery. We're gathering information on as many of the people buried there as we can. There are 700 people about, and I think Chris has come up with information about 698 of them at this point. Not quite, but about most of them. And so we're going to sort of tell the whole history again, but through the people buried in this little cemetery. And it includes everyone from some of the founding fathers of the state of Oregon to Peter McIntosh, to just ordinary people who did extraordinary things in their lives, but who are lost to history, except to those of us crazy enough to spend months digging through the old archives of Oregon newspapers and coming up with incredible, what we think to be, this is a review, so I can say incredible stories for the book. So, we're not done. If you like what we did here, you might have us back a couple more times over the years, I don't know. And with that, if there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer questions.
What's the name of the next book?
The next book is called Fire in a Small Town. And the book after that is called Stories on a Hill. In between, there'll be a book called Bones in Grandpa's Garage. And that's actually a book about my grandfather, my mother's, that's a picture of my mother over there on the table, about her father, who had a box full of bones, human bones in his garage back in Detroit where I grew up. always told us they were the bones of a famous Indian chief, which we always believed as children. And then I got to be an adult and I said, no, wait a minute, why are there bones of a famous Indian chief in Grandpa's garage? And that led me into yet another investigation. And my mother she unfortunately died before we found this out, but it turns out that the house that she lived in when she graduated from college and that sort of thing was on the site of a house built by someone named Oliver Williams, who was the first white settler north of Detroit after the War of 1812, and who, among other things, hosted Alexis de Tocqueville while he was writing Democracy in America. And in Democracy in America, there's a chapter called, I don't remember the exact title, but it's something about reflections on a shimmering lake, where he uses a lake as a metaphor. Well, he wrote that sitting on the hill where my sister and I, sledded and played for years and years and years, and we knew nothing about this. But it does also turn out that as famous as my grandparents' property is, those bones in his garage never belonged to the famous Indian chief, because it turns out there never was a Chief Sashamal. Might as well have been in Gaston, but this was back in Detroit. So that book will be in between. So, questions?
What attracted you to move to Gaston?
Well, I have never lived anywhere but a city. I lived in a high-rise in downtown Portland for many years, New York City, Atlanta, Dayton, San Francisco, moving around for the newspaper business. Never thought about living in the country. But in 2004, I got burned out as a newspaper person. Chris was working at Pacific University in Forest Grove. We just wanted to do something different. So almost on a whim, we bought this little piece of property in Gaston. And for a while, we were thinking, what are we thinking? That was before we knew that you were doomed once you moved to Gaston. We didn't know that at the time. But we moved and fell in love with the place. I don't see us ever leaving. We're hoping we're going to have better luck than all those other people I just talked about. But we love it. And it's not only become the place where we feel we belong, but totally by accident, it's become our career, writing books about this. So, and I'm sorry, I forgot your first name. Julie. Can tell you probably more about the Gaston area than I can, because she knew one of our most famous people, Birgitta Nixon, who is in the book throughout it. She's just a fascinating character and just an amazing place with an amazing history and beautiful. If all you know about the Tualatin River is the little muddy, slow-moving thing you see here, sometime you have to go up to the headwaters of the Tualatin River. It's one of the most beautiful rivers in Oregon. It's incredible. And it's on private property, but you're allowed to trespass. And it's well worth it, because it's just an amazingly beautiful river.
Where is that?
That's up in Cherry Grove, which is the dam there, the broken dam I had, that was damming the headwaters of the Tualatin. It's about 5 miles west of Gaston. So if you go up Highway 47, there are signs to Cherry Grove and Patton Valley Road, and just drive up there. I want to tell one more real quick story. I know I'm over time, but just speaking of that, the chapter I think in the book that is my favorite is one that Chris found in an old textbook, old college textbook on anthropology, written back in the 40s by 3 anthropologists at the University of Washington, and it concerned it was about the Atfalati tribe tracking down the last remaining people who spoke the native language and that sort of thing. And one of the legends that they cataloged was a legend that had been told for hundreds of years about a water being who lived in Wapato Lake, that swampy lake that no longer exists. And this water being loved the lake, but he was mad because it wasn't deep enough to swim in. So finally he got mad enough that he took his tail and dug a channel from the lake to the Tualatin River and drained the Wapato Lake. And then he set out to find a deeper lake, and he couldn't find one. So he went to what is now Cherry Grove and dug a lake himself and said, this is the lake that will be deep enough for me to swim in. But it didn't last a year and drained.